Okay, good morning. Sorry about that delay. I've actually retired from the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication at Reading, but I still have a link there. And I say that because I think I've freed up my thinking and my views by retiring. And that does mean that I will talk about my views, about my biases, but along with scientific research as well. But I want to be very clear that I think there are biases in my talks. I think there are biases in everyone's talk. It's just whether we actually say that there are. So why do I care about disfluency? Well, basically, I suppose, because there was a lot of media interest in it. This comes from 2010. So the BBC picked up on a journal article which said that if we make things harder to read, then we improve learning. And it got picked up by The Economist, talking about learning. And it got picked up by the New York Times, where it's slightly more nuanced because they differentiated between different fonts and font size and things like that, and contrast. And Wired magazine, which rather than talking about hard to read fonts, chooses to call them ugly fonts. And they all came from this journal article in the journal Cognition, a student project, Connor Demon-Yauman, supervised by Daniel Oppenheimer, who talks and has written a lot about disfluency, along with Alter. Then in, I think this was 2018, a group in Australia designed a typeface called Sans Forgetica, which they also claimed boosts learning, boosts memory. As far as I know, the research they did to develop that, it was a designer, Stephen Banham, along with, I'm hesitating before I say psychologists because actually, I think they were sort of business marketing people, but that research, their research hasn't been published, but I will be showing research that relates to Sans Forgetica. So all of that made me rather disturbed. Where am I coming from? I've said I've retired. I sit on the fence between typography and graphic communication and psychology because my training is in psychology. And if I can manage to juggle lots of things, I will be wearing different hats today. This is my designer typography hat. It's supposed to be the most stylish because I don't have many hats. The brown one is my psychology hat. And I wanted to wear other hats today because most of you are probably neither typographers nor psychologists. So maybe from education, linguistics, and so on. But I couldn't put them all in my luggage. So this one is everyone else, which I'll ask you to wear rather than me, really. I think that's only fair. So I'll switch between typographer and designer and psychologist. But I can't identify typefaces by looking at them either. So as I suppose as a typographer, I see disfluency as a threat to legibility. Most of my research career was working out what is easiest to read by looking at things like line length, maybe typefaces. So I feel disfluency is just throwing that all away. As a psychologist, I'd say also, don't ignore how we read. And I hope as I carry on talking, it'll be clear as to what I mean by that, why I think disfluency is ignoring how we read. So this is quite an old model from psychology, showing that we look at the features of letters feed up into the letter level and then the word level. Now, before I say some more about what my focus for today is, I think we should question whether the Disfluency results are reliable. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because I have done it before and I've written about it. So attempts have been made to replicate the article, the studies by Demon Yauman. And I pick on, there are others, but I pick on this in particular. It was a special issue of the journal Metacognition and Learning, which was devoted entirely to either replicating or finding the conditions where you might get disfluency results or not. And I just take one quote. So this article refers to the Demon Yauman article, captured a lot of attention. However, to the best of our knowledge, only a few published studies were able to confirm the basic effect in conceptual replications. So there are problems with the reliability of disfluency's effects. Disfluency effects being where you remember more if you're reading a hard-to-read font. But we mustn't ignore things that can't be replicated. So this is an article from 2021 showing that you're likely to get more citations if your research can't be replicated, which is a rather sad and sorry state of affairs. But it could be to do with the quirkiness of the results, because those will get attention, but perhaps they aren't reliable. But I'm still going to critique it, even though it's an effect which appears to come and go. And we've also got the reliability of the research on sanspagetica. So this is supposed to boost learning, improve memory. But here's a few fairly recent journal articles which show that sanspagetica is novel and hard to read, but that might be it. That's where the effects might end. And then the title of an article by Geller, sanspagetica is not desirable for learning, and disfluent fonts are not always desirable difficulties. And I'll just be talking about desirable difficulties very shortly. So I'm going to critique the original theory. I say the original theory. It's the theory that I only knew about when I first read about this, because it's quoted by Demon Yauman and it's quoted an awful lot. And it's not just about typography or hard-to-read typefaces, it's more general. And it deals with metacognition, so the thinking about thinking, and describes the subjective experience or difficulty associated with a cognitive task. And there needs to be a desirable difficulty, a non-optimal condition, where learning can improve understanding and long-time recall. So just to mention desirable difficulty, this, I think, is quite sound work, which comes from Bjork, 1994. And that was looking at training and doing things like interrupting studying rather than sort of rote learning. And that improves understanding and memory for material. So I think there is something that works in that way, but it's how you interrupt training or how you interrupt reading, I think that's critical. So this is the original theory, and I sort of take issue, no, not sort of, I do take issue with the subjective experience of difficulty. It's suggesting it's not a real, actual difficulty, it's just a feeling of difficulty. So in relation to reading, when we read, we perceive the difficulty, which is supposedly the metacognition. We put in more effort, and therefore we're more likely to remember it. But we put in more effort after the word has been recognized. So we're metacognizing, if such a word exists, that more effort needs to be done. But I'd say no, it's actually in recognizing the word the difficulty lies, not after we've recognizing it thinking, oh, well, I better try and remember that now. I am ridiculing it, which I shouldn't do, but... So if we go back to our model of reading, and this one, there are many drawn like this, but this one's from Kevin Larson, a cognitive psychologist who works at Microsoft. And it's just a reminder that we've got our stimulus word. Some features of that word will be detected, and we're not absolutely certain which they are. We'll identify letters, and from that, we'll recognize a word. So I think this is where the action is when a word is perceptually disfluent. And I started thinking, yes, I don't want it to be a metacognitive thing. I want it to be earlier in the reading process. And I came across a PhD thesis by Geller in 2017. And this is making a distinction between 3 levels. So on the left-hand side, we've got the pre-lexical. So there could be an effect at the feature to letter level. So we might have difficulty picking out the features and identifying the letters. The middle one is described as the lexical level. So there we've got past the pre-lexical. We've got to the letters, but we're having trouble in identifying the letters. So we're getting some feedback from words. So what possible words might there be that fit this group of letters that I'm not sure what these letters are? But if we go on the right-hand side, this is post-lexical, and I think this is where metacognition comes in. So we've worked out what the letters are. We had no difficulty, apparently, and we've got onto the word, but then some higher level processing is going on. So the semantic level is feeding down. I've forgotten to wear my hat. This one should have a psychology hat on, but just imagine I'm wearing it. But there are other theories, and Geller's thesis introduced some of these, and I've built on those. So let's contrast them. It's not exhaustive, it's not comprehensive in any way, but I think it illustrates the mapping onto those 3 levels. So we've got the pre-lexical, the lexical, and the post-lexical, and various research that has looked at determining which of those might be relevant in disfluency. So at the pre-lexical level, this was some work that was done by Hirschman and colleagues in 1994. And this was called the encoding effort, as you can see, the encoding effort hypothesis. So the account here is that we require effort to identify items and enhance memory for those. And there's a sensory manipulation. So we're not using a hard-to-read font. We're changing the text background contrast. You probably can't see the bottom one at all, but that is grey on black. This is a simulation of what might have been done in that paper because there were no illustrations. So don't believe that it's that illegible. It wasn't, because the results actually found there was no difference between the two in recall. So actually, this is not the hypothesis that's been supported. So I've crossed that one out. But you see, Hirschman also came up with a compensatory processing account. So if we look at that one, this is at the lexical level. And this one is saying that hard-to-read words require more higher level or top-down processing. So there's something going on probably between the letter and word level. How high a level? Because maybe it is metacognition and maybe it's coming from a semantic level. So this research compared Sans Fogetica and Times New Roman. And I won't go into any of the details of the study for time, but what they concluded is that in contrast to what the Sanskritika designers were proposing, slower processing doesn't mean deeper semantic processing. So their research was enabled to disentangle the higher level semantic processing from the word level lexical or perceptual orthographic processing. So they're in favor of a lexical account. So to remind you, that's the middle one there. So we'll give a little tick to compensatory processing, but that's not enough. So let's look at some more research. And some research done on handwriting. This isn't a hard to read font, but it does have a bearing on things being difficult to read. And what they did was to compare Courier as a font with handwriting, and you can ignore the right-hand column. This is just from the figure. So to see whether there are any lexical effects which might suggest the level at which processing is occurring. And their conclusion was that, yes, there were lexical effects. And so what must be happening with handwriting is that the inherent physical variability of the words are causing a problem. And I say they're departing from prototype. So a prototype is where you, as a designer, would overlay lots of different letters, lots of letters from different typefaces, and where there's overlap, that's the prototypical form. The alternative is that, or perhaps it's in addition, that in handwriting, the letters are ambiguous or noisy, so it's actually hard to work out what is a D or an E, or so on. And this research by Pereira, using Spanish participants, found that, well, should jump to that, compared difficult to read handwriting with easy to read handwriting with a typeface. And they found that the difficult to read was causing more problems. And from that concluded that the problem is not in the inherent physical variability from the prototype form, but the noisy letter forms, because it's slightly easier. You don't get as many lexical effects if you have easy to read handwriting. And I apologize because I am rushing through. So we're compensating for the difficulty in processing ambiguous letter forms. As both a psychologist and typographer, I'd want to say, well, wait a minute, just how noisy does something need to be, or how ambiguous does it need to be in order to be disfluent? How do we measure the degree of disfluency? That sort of psychology speak, and typography speak would be, what are you calling less legible or illegible? And how do you define hard to read? Because lots of these studies just said, this is hard to read, this is easy to read. For example, this is the student project, the very first study. The top one is disfluent, apparently. The bottom one, fluent. And here are a few more examples. The top ones is the only study that I found in Hebrew, so all the rest are Latin. And we've got left and right for the Arial, that's fluent, Hattenschweiler, less fluent, and so on. So I'm basically saying there wasn't any way of calibrating the disfluency levels. So is there an optimum level? Well, yes, there is. And this research found, I've idealized, but it's an inverted U. So you get better in terms of your performance as the typefaces get less fluent. But if you go too far, then your performance drops again. And those are the examples of what they did from left to right, going from fluent to disfluent. But the trouble is, how do you know for any typeface where it falls on that inverted U? You don't. So we really don't know what sort of level of disfluency is required. So I've crossed out metacognitive theory, which seems a bit harsh on the basis of what I've said to you. And maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should just be adding some question marks to it. But I really do think the problem lies at the level of recognizing letters, recognizing words, and therefore we should be cautious in giving our students or anyone less legible material because the evidence really isn't there. I didn't use my hats enough, but I still would like to thank those who gave me the idea to do that, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
It's Mark Huster. Just one question on understanding the original hypothesis, which indeed, to me at least, seems quite counterintuitive. But what was the granularity they proposed for the use of these disfluent fonts? Individual words that should be highlighted, individual phrases, or should the whole text or significant parts of the whole text be rendered that way?
Well, the student project rendered the whole text that way. Stephen Banham, who designed Sans Forgetica, started by talking about the whole text being rendered that way, and then pulled back and said, no, just on parts that need to be remembered. And I think we're then just back with what typographers would do anyway, which is if there's a part, then you emphasize it in some way. And that might be by putting it in italic or whatever. So it's somewhere between the two, basically.
Yes, I guess a couple of things. What you were saying about not being able to test, I'm wondering if in fact it's that is to test for that optimality on that last graph that you gave. I'm just wondering about the possibility of, say, having a large population of observers and giving them all different levels of legibility and then checking comprehension afterwards and seeing if there's some sort of universal trend?
Yes, I worded that very badly. I suppose I was saying that you can't just take a typeface and assume it's got that certain level. But yes, you would do exactly that. And actually for the handwriting, where there was good handwriting, well, difficult to read and easy to read, that was done with observers. So they did validate that there was a difference. And I've done a little bit of research with David Bretzina on Sans Forgetica, and we asked our participants how legible they thought it was. So we established, as you might imagine, that they thought it was less legible than Arial.
Okay. And then one other question. When you were showing the different colored fonts, the gray on the black and the white on the black, I'm wondering, did anybody ever check yellow on black or orange on black? Because those are common warning colors, and maybe by putting something in a warning type font that would get people edgy or whatever and maybe make it easier to retain on that basis. Was wondering if that had ever been done.
I don't know that that's been researched, no, but although it probably has been done in the context of air traffic control and things like that in terms of the legibility on screen. But not for Disfluency, no, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you.
Christian Paskovich here. First of all, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I have a question regarding the social networks. I mean, there probably is some connections with reading problems and use of internet, but I was wondering if you could perhaps tell me or propose some kind of literature for that sort of problems.
Sorry, what problem? Reading on the internet?
No, is the overuse of social networks like Facebook, TikTok, etc., Instagram, related with metacognitive problems, reading problems? And if it is, could you please, if you know, propose some literature about
I
that
don't, I'm
subject?
afraid. No, I don't immediately. It's a sort of connection that might well be made, but I haven't come across it as yet. No, sorry.
So let us switch to online questions. Terry Joyce?
Yeah, I just wondered if I could ask, given the connection to the memory research, has anyone considered this in terms of Craig and Lockhart's level of processing, the famous 1972 paper? Because it seems to me that you're just at the first level.
Yes.
And what would be consistent with. So why haven't people used that paradigm? Because it was orthographic and it was phonological and it was semantic with their three basic levels. It would just seem obvious that we're at perceptual.
Yes, you're right. And I think some researchers have used that, yeah. But I think Disfluency is very much in the tradition or the school that Alter and Oppenheimer were in. And they draw on William James from 18-something or other and two processing systems. And they argue that we are tricked into using the slower processing system because of the hard to read font. But yeah, Craig and Lockhart, yes, certainly relevant, I agree.
Okay, there has been a thread on the chat started by Cornelia, but now we don't have the time. We have to move to the next speaker, but I will send this chat to everybody so that you can follow. Thank you very much, Mary.